It's always important to take a really big breath before you say anything on the camera. Hi everyone, welcome to week one of the Haftarah half hour. Hopefully, I mean sometimes it might run over. If we do have like a really awesome conversation, Rabbi Neely and I, and there's so much great information, I'll take the best parts and put them into the half-hour show, and then there'll be an extra video, like a bonus content video that you better click halfway through. Also, the text that we read will pop up on the screen as you're watching it, so feel free to pause if you want to read anything and you don't have a Tanakh in front of you. The links to the verses will be under the video, and links to anything that we mentioned that we can get a hard copy of I'll also put underneath the video. So welcome back. Welcome to week one, Rabbi Neely.
Hi, welcome. I'm glad to be here for this wonderful start.
So this week, obviously, the Torah portion is because we're matching the Torah portion cycle. The Haftarah portion will be the one that goes with Bereshit, which is Genesis 1 through 6, verse 8. But the Haftarah portion is from Isaiah, right?
That's right, 42, verse 5.
Now, interestingly, I was looking it up and I found the Haftarah portion, and it went on for pages, but then there was a little note that said that I think it was the Sephardic stop at verse 21, whereas it ran on and on and on. I was quite happy about the verse 21.
The Ashkenazic go on a little bit further, yes. So as we mentioned and discussed in the previous introductory video, the set text for the Haftarah took a little bit of a while to congeal. And there are some differences between the Sephardic and the Ashkenazic traditions, but usually it's just a question of where they stop or where they start. Often it's only by one or two verses. Occasionally it's a bit more.
What I might do is just read a few of the verses, and then we can have a chat and then kind of rough it out and see what it says. So Isaiah chapter 42, and we're starting in verse 5. And I'm reading actually from the Chabad.org site. So said God, the Lord, the creator of the heavens, and the one who stretched them out, who spread out the earth, and what springs forth from it, who gave a soul to the people upon it, and a spirit to those who walk thereon. So I think that's the first obvious link, to Genesis 1.
Exactly right. If you just had that verse, it would be pretty obvious why this was chosen for the book of Bereshit, for the section of Genesis that we read at the beginning of the Torah. It's obviously bringing down very strong the notion of God as creator, of God as the one who set out the entire world. But what I think we're going to want to keep our eye on is the fact that there are many passages throughout the prophets that reinforce the idea that God is a creator. So why this particular section was chosen, it has to be more than just the first verse. There has to be more that's happening here that connects us uniquely to this section of the Torah and is giving us an insight that we might have missed when we did the Torah reading if we didn't have the Haftarah to bring it around.
It's worth mentioning, of course, that this is a conversation that God is having with the prophet, right? He's
Correct.
Given the prophet information. Some of it's for him, some of it is to pass on. So we have to keep the context going all the time. Verse 6, I am the Lord, I called you with righteousness, and I will strengthen your hand. I formed you, and I made you for a people's covenant, for a light to nations. And I've had that translated a light for the nations. And a covenant for the peoples too. But the peoples there are the nations, right?
Correct. It's reminding about one of the unique aspects of Jewish destiny and of our unique connection to God. And indeed, this gives us already our first jump. Partly, though, in the beginning of verse 6, we have to ask a question of who is the you that God has summoned? By the end of the verse, it seems to be clearly the people of Israel. But at the beginning of the verse, it could be, and many commentators argue that it's the prophet Isaiah specifically. But what is interesting is that by the end of the verse, we're definitively talking about the entire nation. And this is a way that the Haftarah is, within the first two verses, talking about the universal and the particular. Because as you know, when you read through the Torah, you don't meet the people of Israel until lots of chapters in. And the Haftarah gives us a little bit of a heads up that we're going to be reading a book called the Torah that talks both about the universal aspects of God, but also the particular path and journey of the people of Israel. And they do that in two verses.
And I've seen, obviously, Light of the Nations is mentioned elsewhere in Isaiah, maybe 49, around there. You get the impression that the conversation starts off with Isaiah definitely being Israel, but him being kind of a seed that's going to hit the message that he's giving is going to increase Israel. It's going to bring people back into the group, which I think we're going to get back to in a moment.
Yes.
Okay, so from 6, which ends for Light to Nations, and into verse 7, to open blind eyes, to bring prisoners out of a dungeon, those who sit in darkness out of a prison. I am the Lord, that is my name, and my glory I will not give to another, nor my praise to graven images. That's, it's quite, I mean, it's way up front, isn't it? I mean, if there was a declaration of who God is and what he does and doesn't do, it's right there in black and white.
Indeed, and it's still referring us back to the Torah portion. You know, the idea of God not yielding his glory to another is a reminder that one of the intrinsic fallacies of idolatry is to ascribe greatness and to ascribe creation or control of creation to some other mythical deity. And God is saying, nope, not having any of that. I did this, as stated here in these first few chapters. I'm the one who's responsible, and I'm the one who gets credit.
When you turn it over and look for the little maiden, it's going to have God's name written on it.
Exactly.
The former things, behold, they have come to pass, and the new things I tell, before they sprout, I will let you hear. Is this saying that I've given you prophecy before, you've seen that prophecy play out, and before the future happens, I'm going to let you know?
Absolutely. It's God reminding the people that getting information from God is something that has happened in the past, and just as it has always been reliable in the past, so too is it reliable in Isaiah's own days. And therefore people should take seriously what's being said. It's not as though the notion of prophecy is something that's new or unheard of to these people. And that, of course, adds a lot of extra weight to the prophet's words.
Isaiah is talking to the people of Israel at this time. They're in captivity. So I guess, yeah.
It's, you know, we probably don't want to get into a long discussion about the biblical criticism on the book of Isaiah at this point. We might want to make that a bonus section.
All right, fair enough.
But Isaiah himself, the actual prophet Isaiah, lived before the captivity began in Babylon. He lived to see the Assyrian assault that destroyed the northern kingdoms and besieged the south and Jerusalem. But he was able to see through to the end of that siege and Sennacherib's retreat, leaving the southern kingdom still alive. It took another 150 years or so before it was wiped out by the Babylonians. But whether or not it's the same prophet writing this as writing the earlier sections of Isaiah, like I said, is for a bonus section. But definitely these words were meant to be words of comfort to those who lived in Babylon after the exile. So we can argue about who put pen to parchment, but the main target of these words were definitely those who were in exile in Babylon.
One of the former things might have been, for example, King Cyrus relieving Israel from its captivity and sending them back to rebuild the temple. That's in that bracket, right?
Absolutely, and you know that was a major source of hope, that the Jews who were in Babylon and in captivity, they held on, that just as God had foretold that there would be a destruction if the community did not restore justice and true faith to the community, and just as that came true, so too the prediction of redemption would come true. So it was ironically, people could take solace from the foretold destruction that had taken place because that also meant that the foretold return would take place.
Which I think we're going to get to in a moment.
Yes.
Verse 10, sing to the Lord a new song, his praise from the end of the earth. Those who go down to the sea and those therein, the islands and their inhabitants. And the deserts, its cities shall rise. And it's got their voices in brackets there, so I think that means it doesn't exist in the text. It's put in there to make it easier to read in English.
Right. It's implied by the Hebrew quite clearly, but it's not actually there in the Hebrew text.
And its cities shall raise their voice. Kedar shall be inhabited with villages. Now, Kedar, is that a place or a town?
Yes.
Or
Yes.
Okay. Oh, so I see. The land, Kedar, shall be inhabited with villages. The rock dwellers shall exult, from the mountain peaks they shall shout. Does this give the impression that everybody's singing this song?
Oh, and it's sort of a broad area. It's saying it's like widespread rejoicing.
They shall give glory to the Lord, and they shall recite his praise on the islands. The Lord shall go out like a hero, like a warrior shall he arouse zeal. He shall shout, he shall even cry, he shall overpower his foes. I'm assuming that the use of the word cry is more of a scream than crying.
Exactly. If you look in in some of the other translations, you'll see words like shout or roar. It's not the Hebrew word for crying, meaning tears crying.
Now, the next part starts with I. Are we still is this God speaking, or is this Isaiah speaking?
No, this is God speaking still. But it's rather than Isaiah reporting what God is going to do or God is going to say, this is more meant to be a prophetic quote of as if God were speaking.
I was silent from time immemorial. I am still. I restrain myself. Like a travailing woman will I cry. I will be terrified and destroy them together. Travailing isn't that a nice way of saying giving labor? Giving birth.
Right. Exactly right. And again, this is as we mentioned before. One of the difficulties with the Haftarah is sometimes the metaphors are not 100% accessible. But in the ancient world, a woman in labor was the ultimate symbol of doing something with great hardship and with great tumult, to be diplomatic. There's no epidurals, no additional anesthetic, and although obviously women were able to give birth quite regularly, this was not an easy process, and it wasn't a comfortable process. And so this was a symbol of travail, of labor, of shouting and great effort and great tumult.
I will destroy mountains and hills, and all their grass I will dry out, and I will make rivers into the islands, and I will dry up the pools. And I will lead the blind on a road they did not know, in paths they did not know I will lead them. I will make darkness into light before them, and crooked paths into straight ones. These things I will do them, and I will not forsake them. That's a very powerful verse.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a common set of metaphors of making the return, of making the path back easier. That leading someone from light to dark, and we'll come back to that metaphor, I think, when we talk about some more of the connections to the Torah portion. But making light into dark and making the road level and smooth and straight was very much a metaphor for how to get from one place to another. Again, we maybe don't feel it as much in the modern world, but if you hike and if you walk, there's a very big difference between how far you can walk and hike on smooth, level, straight ground, and how far you can hike if it's bumpy, rough, up and down, and not good light. So this is something that would have been immediately evocative to making life easier for the average person.
And I have to say, for me, in the world that I live in today, my synapses are going crazy. As someone who has left the tradition of their youth and kind of embracing Judaism, there's lights all over this. It's like Vegas going off on that on that verse. They shall turn back greatly ashamed, those who trust in the graven image, who say to the molten images, "You are our gods." You deaf ones listen, and you blind ones look and see. Who is blind but my servant, and deaf as my messenger, whom I will send? He who was blind, is the one who will receive his payment, and he who was blind is a servant of the Lord. I read that through a couple of times. There are some parts there when you kind of ask yourself, if Israel is a servant here, and he was blind, are they talking about Israel's fall into idolatry?
Exactly. And actually, if you'll give me a moment, I have a translation from the Jewish Publication Society, JPS, and
okay.
While some things in their translation I like, some things I don't. This one, I think they capture the rhetorical and the rhetoric of this particular section a bit more clearly to modern ears. English is tricky, so this is their take on it.
Okay.
So this is verse 19. Who is so blind as my servant, so deaf as the messenger I send? Who is so blind as the chosen one, so blind as the servant of the Lord? So they're really just a set of very sharp criticisms for Israel. And of course, Israel's blindness is considered to be the greatest blindness there is in the world, because we had the most visions given to us of what was true and what was right. And so for us to be blind, it means our blindness is greater than anyone else's, because we should be able to see it better. And so that's why we're getting this a special thumping from God in this section.
I notice it goes straight from speaking about the idols. The Torah doesn't really, the Torah itself, the story of Israel's development, doesn't really talk about Israel taking on idols. We get a few instances where people bring idols into the camp, but as a people, they kind of on the straight and narrow most of the time. So it's interesting to hear now of a kind of a very different landscape for the Jewish people.
Well, it depends on which section you're reading. If you're reading through the Torah, then yes, there's very little mention of idolatry. We have the Egel HaZahav, the golden calf incident, but apart from that, there's some idolatrous activities that go on when we interact with other nations. But the Torah itself, you don't get a lot of idolatry, which makes all of the language of anti-idolatry in the Torah very surprising. But as soon as you go into the book of Joshua, and especially into the book of Judges, you see it all falls apart. You see that idolatry is indeed absolutely pervasive. And this is something that, interestingly enough, the archaeology backs up 100%. That during that time period of the early Israelite nation, you find idols in just about every hovel and house that is unearthed in the land of Israel. You dig down deep enough, and there's just little statues here, little fetishes there, little idols over there. It seemed to really be pervasive throughout the entire nation. And so the language of the prophet of being so antagonistic to idolatry is very understandable. Because even though the Torah doesn't talk about the Israelites getting into idolatry very much, as soon as you get into the Tanakh, the rest of the Bible and the prophetic works, it's clear that idols were what most people were doing and most people had. And all the bad things that went along with it, as the idol is talking about, were the target of much of those prophetic works.
There is much to see, but you do not observe. To open the ears, but no one listens. The Lord desires this for his righteousness' sake. He magnifies the Torah and strengthens it. And that's the end of that Haftarah portion.
For the Sephardim. The Ashkenazim do go on, right?
What's the traditional view there? If I was to go into a random selection of synagogues, would I find that most of them end there, or would it be 50-50? Or
most synagogues in Europe, except for the Spanish, will do the Ashkenazim. They'll continue on for the rest. If you're in Latin America and in many parts of the Middle East, if you were in many parts of the Middle East where Jews used to live and have unfortunately been mostly expelled, but if you went to their communities now in Israel or where they're living in other parts of the world, they would stop there. But most American synagogues, most European synagogues would keep going.
Well, it's interesting for me then that this the Chabad here does just stop. That's interesting. Or would you prefer to do the whole?
Well, it's quite representative. Chabad follows a tradition of Hasidism that was based upon teachings of scholars in Israel during the 1500s, and they felt, the scholars there, that the traditions of many of the Sephardim were superior to the traditions of the Ashkenazim, so they changed. Even though they were Ashkenazic originally, they changed and adapted to model themselves in some ways after the Sephardic traditions. And so you ended up with this very strange blend in the liturgy. It's why when you go into a Jewish bookstore, you'll see a couple different versions of the Sidurims, of the prayer books. You'll see an Ashkenazic version, you'll see a Sephardic version, and then you'll see a blended version that comes from this time period where people were trying to adapt what they thought were the best traditions of both. And Chabad followed the Sephardic tradition then of where to stop in this particular case. But most other Orthodox and conservative synagogues would keep going at this point.
Would you like to keep going?
Well, let's take a look at what we've got. Many of the things that we might say about the next few passages that are in the Ashkenazic tradition have already been mentioned or at least hinted at in the Sephardic tradition, which is probably one reason why the Sephardim don't mind stopping where they are. They've at least mentioned the major themes that the rest of it encompasses. There's not much that's being left out. It's reinforcement and restatement that comes in the next few passages. We'll take what we've got and we'll discuss it from there.
So maybe on a week-by-week basis, we'll have a look and see what the content is, and if we need to expand, we'll expand, and if we don't, we'll stop.
And if people, as a little tip, a helpful tip, if people are looking for an English translation of the Haftarah and to see both versions, there's a great website out there called Hebcal, Hebcal, and they give all sorts of information about the Hebrew calendar, but they also have links to the JPS translation for both the Torah portion and the Haftarah, which gives them another place to find a good translation to. Remember, no translation is ever going to be sufficient by itself, and even one person's reading of the Hebrew is never sufficiently by itself. We have to continue to read and to discuss to get all the meaning out that we can.
So, as an observer, this Haftarah portion we've read here seems to have a beginning and a middle and an end. Would that be a fair assumption?
Unusually so, yes. It's true that most Haftarah do have a definitive end, although often the end is arbitrary. That is to say, the end was constructed by where the tradition decided to stop. Because certainly Isaiah didn't necessarily choose to stop only there. He had a lot more to say, another 20-some chapter or so. It's a bit artificial, but it's important to recognize what was being intended by that artificial stop that the rabbis chose. And of course, in this particular case, they're stopping on a high note. They're trying to pick up. So yes, you can definitely say in this Haftarah we have a beginning, a middle, and an end.
I get from this that they aren't just trying to remind people about the creation, but also that the people in the story, just in this chapter in 42, we find out that the people are praising God at one moment. Mm-hmm. Then they kind of fall into idolatry, and then God pulls back some of those people that are in idolatry. He's, as it says, he leads the blind into light. Although I wonder, is that more about Isaiah's role?
No, I think you're right on the target. That it's trying to show a pattern which is recurrent throughout Jewish history, especially during the prophetic period. Although in other ways, throughout history, all the way to the present day, of an upswell of understanding, of connection, and of faith, and then a decline into bad ways. We'll use a sort of general euphemism, and then a return, a resurgence. That there is always going to be a portion that do not get pulled aside or that get pulled out of whatever the community has fallen into. That begins that next upswing and next phase of a high point in our history. And this little section, it sort of encapsulates that flow very well. As you say, it's not just about creation. It's clear that they are trying to say by this selection that creation began and that we have an obligation because of creation, we have an indebtedness that creates a right for God to speak to us. That's something that's emphasized even more in the Ashkenazic version, where it reminds us about having been formed by God, both as individuals and as a nation, and therefore God has the right to give us orders, something that a lot of people don't like to admit. And then this notion of, despite that, we have this slide into idolatry. And I think that that's partly, and partly for exactly that metaphor you have of light and dark, of blind and eyes opened, that this particular section, of all the sections which deal with this exact same theme, was chosen for these first few chapters of the book of Bereshit, the book of Genesis. Because one of the things that's most interesting in its parallelism is this notion of opening of eyes. We read from the story of creation that when Adam and Eve ate from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that their eyes were opened. And that sets in motion an awful lot of things. And their eyes being opened leads them to make some mistakes. Whereas here we're seeing eyes being opened to lead us towards our proper path. And that contrast is I think, a beautiful bit of poetic construction, not just from Isaiah's view, but by the rabbis of choosing that they would use a positive metaphor for having eyes opened to contrast the negative metaphor of having our eyes opened from the garden.
Well, I loved that there was a verse here, I'm just trying to find, that mentioned, and they will be ashamed. And that kind of sprung out as you were saying that.
Yes.
So yeah, there's kind of a polar opposite between those two ideas, but they both result in a person realizing that they've done something wrong and having a choice to fix it.
Right, and I think there are two different types of blindness. When the eyes are opened by Adam and Eve in the garden, their eyes are open to the material world, and that's when they see their physical nakedness. But in a way, their eyes are partially closed to a spiritual sight when that happens. And the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was really giving them a false perception that they could not just choose between good and evil, but that they could decide good and evil. Which is why God's chastisement of them, of who told you were naked, of who told you that was wrong. And they sort of have to say, well, we kind of decided it was wrong. And that's where God is saying, you're deciding based upon the physical world what you think is right and wrong, which means your eyes are open to the physical, but you're becoming blind to the spiritual, being blind to what I can show you is right or wrong. And Isaiah is talking about reversing that if we turn our eyes away from the physicalness of idols, the physicalness of what the surface of the world seems to indicate, and we open our eyes to the light that God has given us through Torah and through Judaism, that we will be ashamed. We will be embarrassed by what we had been doing, because we'll recognize that we were walking spiritually naked through life and not properly clothed in the clothes of Torah that we had been given, and not therefore acting in the proper way.
When we go down to verse 19, who is blind but my servant and deaf as my messenger, and I think we were talking about Israel at that point. Can
Yes.
you expand a little on? So in my one it says who was blind as in the one who received his payment, and you had a different translation in JPS.
Right. Go ahead.
I'm just wondering how that plays out in the text. For someone to be blind would assume that they don't know what they're doing or where they're going. But it seems a funny translation here. As one who's received his payment, is that kind of a punishment?
No. This is a choice. That God is saying that we are selectively blind, and our blindness is superior, is greater than the blindness of anyone else. If you take it like a vision chart. Right, if you have two people and they're trying to measure their vision, and one can read the top line and the second line, and the other can only read the top line, you would say the person who can only read one line is more blind than the person who read two lines. But what God is doing here is saying that it's not just that we are worse than others, because we know historically and from the prophetic readings that we're not worse than others. We've practiced idolatry like the other nations. So why would God say that we are more blind, that we are more deaf, that we are worse than others? It's because God gave us these. God gave us glasses. And so if we choose to keep the glasses in our pockets and we still can't read the chart, then we are more willfully blind than the people standing next to us who never had a pair of glasses in their life. And that's why God is so much more irate with us. And we see that theme throughout many of the prophetic sessions, that those who have a reason, a better reason to do right or to do what is good, and who choose not to, are always much more admonished than those who didn't know right from wrong in the first place. That very statement to the prophet Jonah, when he tells them that he shouldn't be so upset with the people of Nineveh because they don't even know their right from their left. It's the same reason why Obadiah, the prophet Obadiah, slams the Edomites when they joined in with the looting and sacking of the people of Judah when the Babylonians came in. It's not because they were the worst, but because they were our brothers, and they should not have joined in looting with us. And similarly here, God is saying, you should know better. I also like to think that there's a little bit of a push here. It's very easy to read the book of Genesis, and especially those first few chapters about Adam and Eve, but also the later failings of humanity, and to sit back and almost laugh at their failings. If God tells you not to eat the fruit, what kind of person eats the fruit? I mean, Adam and Eve, they must have been the worst, most spiritually bankrupt, the most ridiculously blind people ever in the world. And the people who led up to the nation of the flood, I mean, come on. You didn't have that much to do. It wasn't that hard to keep right. It wasn't as hard for you to be righteous as it is for us. So what's your excuse? We kind of scoff at the ancients for their immorality. And this is flipping it and saying, no, being immoral when you are the later generations is a greater failing than being immoral at the beginning. Adam and Eve, yes, they made a mistake, but they had very little help to avoid that mistake. And the generations of the flood, yes, they made mistakes, but they had very little history and support and guidance of how to avoid those mistakes. But we, speaking to either the nation of Isaiah or speaking to us in the modern world, we should know better, we should see more clearly than anyone else. And our continued blindness, therefore, is compounded generation by generation by generation.
It's almost selective, right? And it says in verse 20, there's so much for you to see, but you don't observe it, to open the ears, but no one listens. And that kind of, I think that just expands on what you were just saying. And I'm reminded that the Torah says that if a person sins but doesn't know it's a sin, it's not going to be looked at as grievously as somebody that knows they're definitely doing something wrong.
Right, absolutely.
And so I think we'll just read through the last verse again. The Lord desires this for his righteousness' sake. He magnifies the Torah and strengthens it. God's calling his people back to be a light to the nations, to kind of elevate and to shine his righteousness. When I read the word righteous, I kind of see your profile, or the way you're like when you're on Facebook. You have this lovely big Facebook page full of all the things you've done during a day, and you can choose to fill that with good stuff, or you can choose to fill that with bad stuff, and you could call that your righteousness page. You could have a really righteous page or not a very righteous page. And so when I read the word righteousness in the Torah and in the Tanakh, I'm reminded that as far as God's concerned, he's God anyway. He can do what he wants, but how he's reflected in the world is down to how people treat him and how they represent him in their lives. So when I read through, he requires this and desires this for his righteousness' sake. Is that about that? Is that about how he's held by people in their lives and how others look at his chosen people as a reflection of him.
But certainly that is a big part of it. But you're absolutely right that a lot of people misunderstand this notion. They say, Lema'an Sidko, for his righteousness, and they think that this is God's PR campaign, that God is worried that he's not getting good press if things aren't going ways that reflect well on him. And what God is trying to say here is that because of his righteousness, this is what will happen. That is to say, because of God's justice, which is Sidko, comes from the word tzedek, the Hebrew word for justice. Because of God's justiceness, which doesn't work in English, this is what will happen. That God is not going to let the world descend and degrade into chaos, that God is not going to let the Jewish people and Torah disappear, because it is a pillar of the world. And because of what God is as a force of justice, that can't be the end. It has to come back, it has to be restored, it has to be reinvigorated, and the cycle has to come back up again. And in fact, this particular line, this verse 21, is said daily during Jewish prayers. At the end of the prayer that we call Uva L'Tzion, which comes right near the end of the morning service, and a few other places as well, this line is quoted. Many times people don't recognize how many quotes there are in the Jewish prayer service, because unless you have a siddur, a prayer book with footnotes, you just think that this is a prayer, and you don't realize you're quoting very important passages. But when you hit this line in that prayer in Uva L'Tzion, it is an ultimate reminder that no matter how bad things look, no matter how corrupt things have become, that's not going to be the end. It doesn't just continue in a perpetual slide. That because God is this force of justice and righteousness in the world, there will be a turn. It will come back up. There will be glory. There will be Torah that will illuminate and shine into the world again. Darkness can't win. It just goes against the nature of God. It goes against the nature of the world.
Amen. That's awesome. Oh well, I think we did a decent job.
Great. I really appreciated and enjoyed the conversation and discussion, and I look forward to hearing what people have to say in the comments.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm looking forward to sharing it. So if you're watching this, then somewhere in October, I think. Thanks for watching, because we're kind of doing these ahead of time to make sure they're all ready. Thank you, Rabbi Joshua Neely, for coming and joining us in this series. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for letting me be part of the beginning.
Very good. Cheesy humor. We're going to get along fine. Thank you, viewers, for watching. Again, if you've got questions or comments, leave them below. Please give the video a thumbs up. It really helps spread the content to other people that might have typed Bible into their search box. And subscribe to the channel. Thanks all for coming along, and we'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.
And we're done. Awesome. Oh, man,
okay.
I think that went okay.